I'm going to go ahead and get started here. And we are recording today, so I may repeat a question or say something so that it's on the video for people to watch later. But we are going to jump in. We have a relatively new contract of sale that went active as of the first of the year. And so we have had classes already that went through the changes between the two contracts, what the old contract was like and what the new contract's like compared to the old contract. This is not going to be that class. This is going to be just a kind of an overview of the contract. What this class also is not is it's not a buyer workshop or a seller workshop where we're not going to go through and necessarily talk about a ton of different strategies. There are different strategies you can use when writing a contract to kind of structure it in a way that's more beneficial for your buyer or more beneficial for your seller. But that is for a different day in one of our buyer workshops or seller workshops. This is really a lot more just to address what the contract means so that there's a general understanding of what it is and why things are a certain way. And for those that are maybe watching the recording, I think everybody in the room knows who I am, but if you may be watching the recording, my name is Carroll. I am the team leader and CEO at Carroll Palmetto here. And also what other people may not know is that I'm also the chairman of our contract committee in Columbia. And so at the CCRA. So this contract is something that the previous version was one that we had done in 2016, and then this one was one that we put together a lot of ideas and thoughts and released this for this year. So I have a lot of hand in that, fortunately and unfortunately. If you like the contract, I have a lot of contributions. If you don't like it, it probably wasn't my fault.
It was Becky.
I'm going with that. So, all right, so we will dive in here. So to start with, there is a bold line there at the top, which is probably seldom used. It should be used more often than it is. That's when an agent is buying or selling their own property. It's required that you have all caps, bold, underlined on the first page, the top of the first page, that you have to disclose that you are a party to the transaction. And so I would recommend doing that in all cases where you are a party to the transaction at all, whether you are definitely the owner or if you have an interest in an LLC that's the owner, if a spouse is selling it, whatever it might be. If it's questionable, I would check the box. Over disclosing is better than under disclosing. So
significant other, family members.
Yeah, check the box. All right, so then the first two there, buyer and seller, there are some initials there, and that is to confirm with your client or your customer that the relationship as defined and that you have given them and gone through that South Carolina Disclosure of Real Estate Brokerage Relationships form. So we want to make sure that the client is initialing there, and then obviously that's not something that we fill out for the seller. They're going to initial for the seller, but we can assume that we're not going to initial it for them. Obviously, you're never initialing anything for another party, but we can assume if the house is listed on the MLS that they're going to be a client. And that's one of the first things to know about writing a contract is that you have to complete everything. So there's no such thing as leaving blanks for the seller to fill out. That's not something you have to send an offer that is just signable and initialable by the other party, and it can be a valid contract. So we can assume that when we're working with a buyer, if the house is listed on the MLS, that they're a client. If we don't know the answer, that's a question we ask the other party before we write the contract. So are you working with them in a client relationship or is it a customer relationship, whichever, and we check that box. So we check the box according to those answers, and we have our client initial, and the seller's blank would be not initialed until the seller gets the offer from us. So then we jump into the terms of the offer. So the first paragraph here, that Roman numeral 1 there next to term of offer, that's where we're going to define everything about, we're going to start to define everything about the contract and what our terms are. So first line there, we're entered into on this date, so we put the date in that blank. Buyer and seller, we put their names. That's something that we're going to verify. We want to verify what the seller's name is via the tax records, and then go back and look at that according to the MLS sheet. Every now and then you're going to have a conflict where the MLS says that Mr. Jones owns the property and the tax records say Ms. Smith owns the property, and so we want to verify then. We got a conflict. Which one of those is right? It could be that the online tax records aren't updated, and that the agent knows that there was something that happened where Mr. Jones passed away and Ms. Smith got the property, so it is her property now, and the deed just hasn't been recorded online yet. And so if that's the case, I would just ask for some verification of that to know who to put on the contract. You want to make sure you've got the correct party on that contract. If it's an LLC, you want to make sure that you know the name of the LLC. If you're working with a buyer and it's, you want to make sure that you've got the actual legal name of your client. We're not just writing, Bob Jones on there. If, hey, is it Bob, is it Robert, which one is it? Make sure we get the right names on there. In the case of an LLC, we want to make sure that we have the legal documentation that shows who's allowed to sign for that LLC. So we don't just write ABC LLC signed by John Smith. We want to make sure that John Smith is actually a member of that LLC and has the signing authority. So we would need to get the articles of incorporation from that LLC to show that he's a signer. All right, then we get into definitions. So number 2 there under that Roman numeral 1 is definitions. So business day is the first thing that we define. A single business day is defined as a 24-hour period beginning at 8 a.m. of any weekday, Monday through Friday. It does not begin on a Saturday or a Sunday or a federal legal holiday. So for the purposes of the contract, the first business day begins at 8 a.m. of the next business day following final contract acceptance. And so this is one of the more important paragraphs in the contract. That's why it's first on the first page, because there's lots of deadlines, there's lots of definitions of deadlines throughout the contract. And so we want to make sure that we know what a business day is and when the deadlines start, when they end. So some people in the room are experienced contract writers. You don't have to answer this question, but it defines it right there as 8 a.m. of the business day following final contract acceptance. So what that means then is if we had a due diligence period, would there be any times where a time period ends at 5 p.m.? There wouldn't be, because everything starts at 8 a.m. and it's a 24-hour period. So there's a lot of agents, and there's other contracts floating around. This is the state contract that uses specific times of day that you can write in those times of day. Our contract, unless it's changed, unless somebody crosses that out and changes it, but our contract begins at 8 a.m. of whatever business day, and the business day goes for a 24-hour period.
So we signed it today, signed it today, starts tomorrow.
Starts tomorrow at 8 a.m.
That's our first day.
That's their first day. Yeah. And it goes for, we'll get to that later, but it goes for 10 days. So it's never going to end at 3 p.m. on a certain day. It always ends at like 7:59 a.m. of whatever that day is. Yep. All right, and so then contract acceptance. This is where it defines when a contract is accepted. So successful negotiation of this offer will have been completed when one of the parties to the negotiation places the final required signatures and/or initials on the offer. It will occur at the date and time when the party subsequently delivers a copy to the other party. Then that party that receives the fully executed, fully signed contract with no more changes is the one that fills out the very bottom of the contract. We'll show you in a little bit, and then sends it back to the other party. So that's a very important one also, that you go back and forth negotiating. So an offer comes in and your client wants to change a couple things. We cross through the price, we cross through some other things. We initial it, send it back to the other party. They might cross through some things and initial it, send it back to us. It goes back and forth. But once there's a meeting of the minds, once it's like, okay, yep, this is what we want to do, that last party puts their initials on the contract and said, okay, we're essentially accepting this. They send it to the other party. That is when contract acceptance has happened. Because, hey, I've accepted everything that you've offered and everything you've said, so here you go, I'm accepting that. So once that other party gets it, contract's accepted.
That's more performance after that. That's like the contract.
Yep, well, the contract is accepted.
Okay.
It hasn't been fulfilled yet because you got to go through closing and all that stuff. But yes, that's when the contract is a valid contract. And so that last party then will fill out the bottom of the contract to say, yes, at 2:30 p.m. on this date, I received the fully executed, final ratified contract. However, if that box is not filled out, that doesn't change the validity of the contract. So the contract was still accepted because the party accepted it, sent it back to the other party to let them know, hey, I've accepted. And the clock and the time period starts. All that last paragraph, or that last box to fill out, all that does is just says, yes, we're all in agreement. It's clearly defined. but it was defined even without filling that box out.
It's easier, I'm just gonna throw in, it's easier if that box is filled out because it does say that defines timelines.
Right.
So we still wouldn't have that much of an issue with timelines because it would be with the last one signed and accepted, but it's an easier
Yep.
reference point. So I,
Just clearly defining so all parties, hey, this is what we've agreed on, this is when it was agreed upon. So closing, that's just defined as the date and the time the attorney disperses funds. And so as part of a closing, funds aren't dispersed until documents are signed, funds are dispersed, keys are transferred. Keys aren't given until funds are transferred. And that's the definition of a closing. So once the party actually has their money and the keys have transferred, it is closed. Broker, that just defines who we are. We're affiliated with the buyers and sellers brokers. And then notice and delivery. This is just defines how notice and delivery can happen. So that can happen in person or by professional courier service or fax if you live in 1987, or email transmission. Generally, most things are happening via email transmission nowadays and e-signature platforms. So number 3, property. This is where you define the property that the offer is happening on or the contract is being agreed upon. So there's some things there: lot, block, phase, subdivision. Those are things that you're going to learn from the tax records. What I'll tell you is always use tax records when you're writing an offer. We don't use MLS because that agent might have misspelled something or mistyped something, and then that's going to give you an inaccurate contract. So we always are going to pull the tax records from the website to fill this information out. You're not always going to be able to know a lot, block, and phase. That's not something that's always on every deal, but you should always know an address and you should always know a tax map number and a county. Obviously, if you're gonna write a tax map number, you got to write a county because every county does tax mapping differently, and so they're going to have different numbers. You got to make sure you're defining it's the tax map number of this within this county, and then address, city, and zip are important. Subdivision, if you can find it, that's important. You want to fill it out as completely as you can. So we want to make sure that that's on there. Purchase price, that is where you write in the offer. That's going to define the purchase price, the end purchase price that the buyer is going to pay to the seller. Expiration of offer, this is an important one also. So number 5 right there, top of page 2. Expiration of offer. This offer from buyer will be withdrawn at blank o'clock p.m. or a.m. on blank date. So you just write whatever the number is, o'clock, and you write your a.m. or p.m. there, and defines that it's Eastern time. And then the important part of that, it says, unless accepted or countered by seller in written form prior to such time. So if there's not a written counter, then the people who are making the offer are not obligated to anything at that point. They don't necessarily have to say that I'm not going to honor the offer. If we were to write in a 5 p.m. deadline on this contract, and the seller comes back at 6 o'clock and says, okay, we'll accept it. You'd have the option of saying, no, it's past 5 and the offer's not valid anymore. Or you'd have the option of saying, yeah, okay, that's fine. We'll go ahead and sign it. It'll be fine. But then just know that once you make a counter offer, unless you change this, that counter offer does not have a deadline, because this says unless accepted or countered by the seller. So once that seller has countered, unless the seller writes a deadline, unless you write a new deadline when you make the offer back to the other party, then there's no deadlines at that point. So if you ever make an offer that isn't responded to, you always want to make sure that you go back and say, hey, we made an offer and they offered us $200,000. The seller came back and said, no, we need $250,000. If you haven't heard from that buyer, you need to go back as that seller. Especially if you get another offer or whatever, you need to go back to that buyer and say, hey, we're withdrawing that counter offer, because it's just an open-ended time frame. They can sign it in 2 months and say, okay, cool, we decided we'll accept it, and there wasn't a deadline on it, so you're kind of obligated there. So you got to always make sure you're protecting your clients in that way.
So how do you withdraw? What do you do?
It's as simple as an email.
Just an email?
Yep. Just, hey, we're the counter we made, or the $250,000 counter offer we made at such and such a time on such and such a date is hereby withdrawn. Please confirm receipt of this email, and that would be enough to do it. All right, so number 6 is earnest money. This is an important paragraph because this is like the deposit that the buyer is going to put up to secure and collateralize the offer. And there are a couple different options in the way that works. Here at our company, the earnest money is always going to be held in trust by an attorney. We don't hold it as our brokerage. There are still some companies that hold it as a brokerage, but that's not something we do here at Carroll Palmetto. So you're going to check brokerage there, and you're going to write in you're going to check attorney there, and you're going to write in which attorney is holding it. That's generally going to be the closing attorney. A lot of agents have a closing attorney they work very closely with. At the end of the day, that's the client's choice what attorney they want to use, but that's the attorney we're going to write in there. That can be Blair Cato, it could be MGC, it could be Bell Carrington. There's a lot of different attorneys in town. And then B, you're going to write earnest money is paid by, and that will be obviously whichever way it's going to be paid, check, cash, wire, or other. There are some attorneys that have services now like Zocum or Earnest, where you can actually scan your Earnest check in with your phone and then shoot it right to the attorney through their little system. It goes right to their account. And so the key to that paragraph, though, is that you need to check whether it has already been delivered or whether it will be delivered by. Generally, when you're making an offer, that earnest money a lot of times has not been delivered yet. And so these options didn't used to be there on the old contract, and so we had to jump through a lot of hoops. So now the new contract has that option. So, hey, we're making an offer today on Wednesday, and if everything is accepted, it's going to be delivered by Friday. Now, the thing to know is that you've got to make that date be a date that you know you can accommodate. Because if we say we're making an offer today on Wednesday, earnest money will be delivered to the escrow agent by Friday at 5 p.m. So Friday, April 20, whatever that is, 27th at 5 p.m. If it takes until Friday at 7 p.m. to get the offer negotiated out, it's really hard to get the earnest money there if you hadn't already got it there, because you're past your deadline at that point. So if you're negotiating and that deadline is getting close for the escrow money, you've got to slide that deadline back as part of your negotiations. So either give it enough time that you know you've got plenty of time to negotiate it, or pay attention to it and make sure you're sliding that date back during your negotiations, because you don't want to go under contract and already be immediately out of contract because you haven't fulfilled one of the obligations to the contract you just agreed upon, right? And so if the earnest money is not deposited by that deadline, then the contract could be voided at the seller's option. The seller doesn't have to void it, but they have the option to just say, hey, you didn't get your earnest money in and I'm out. There's also not a deadline for that. So if you say, hey, I'm going to get it in there by Friday at 5 p.m. and then Monday at 2 p.m. is when you actually drop it off, and you go through the whole contract and the seller decides that, hey, there's this better offer coming along, you didn't get your earnest money and I'm out. It'd be a big argument, but they can say, hey, you didn't fulfill your end of the deal and get the earnest money in on time when you were supposed to, so we're out. So if that were to happen and you proceed forward with the contract, that's something to get confirmation from them to say, hey, yes, we realize that the earnest money wasn't in and we're okay with that, we're moving forward with the contract, and then they wouldn't be able to go back and void it. Does that make sense? Earnest money is a big deal. It's something to really keep track of. When you're on the seller side, it's something you'd be making that phone call to that attorney right there, or sending that email to the attorney at that deadline, right? So if you're working with the seller and the contract is written and it says earnest money is going to be delivered by 5 p.m. on Friday, I'm making a phone call to that attorney or sending an email at 4:59, making sure, hey, do you actually have this earnest money or not? Because that's my obligation to the seller, to make sure I'm protecting them. And if the earnest money isn't in, they've got to know they've got the option to walk away and take another offer if they want to.
Quick question, is earnest money considered like consideration?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, that's the consideration. Yep.
Actually, I'd like to interject that. Consideration is actually the purchase price. So you can go into a contract and have zero earnest money, and you still have consideration in the contract value. Because the purchase price is the consideration.
So, okay. That makes sense.
Just to clarify that. So do you think somebody that's the seller or seller's agent is going to accept a contract with zero earnest money? Probably not. But you can always go into a contract with zero earnest money,
right, with
the consideration being the purchase price.
Okay.
Sorry, just had to
You're good.
I appreciate it.
Yep. Yeah, earnest money can be consideration. Doesn't have to be the consideration.
Right.
Yeah. It could also be any number of things. It could be, I'm giving you my Kit Kat bar, and that's my consideration.
Love and affection.
Yep. So paragraph C, 6C, additional earnest money. That in some cases, people decide that they're going to give additional earnest money. Sometimes it's like, hey, we're going to put up earnest money now, and then we're going to put up some more once we get through inspections or whatever it might be, just to try to make the contract more enticing for the seller to take. But that line is there is where you would fill that part out. Pretty self-explanatory. And then once you put up additional earnest money, that all throughout the rest of the contract, that's all clumped in as the earnest money together. So then there's a bunch of legalese coverage in this next paragraph D here that just covers the escrow agent. It talks about how it will work if for some reason the paragraph is voided. This is the paragraph that you'll see throughout the contract. They reference back to this paragraph where if for some reason the contract falls through for whatever reason, you go back to this paragraph here, and this is what's going to define what happens. So if the earnest money is to be determined to be fraudulent, the escrow agent has the authority and will immediately notify all the parties. But it could be deposited in an interest-bearing account. You're not going to get the interest from it if you're the buyer. But the big part of it is if a dispute arises between the buyer and seller, what happens after that. And so a written release must be done in order to release earnest money. So that's the whole thing with this. One party can't just say, you know what, never mind, I don't want to buy it anymore, give me my earnest money back. And the sellers also can't just say, hey, he just defaulted, give me the earnest money. There's got to be an agreement in place that says, hey, we're walking away. The seller says, hey, that's okay. Yes, you get your earnest money back, or hey, we're going to split the earnest money, or whatever it might be. There has to be an agreement in place that says, here's how that's going to happen. And if there isn't an agreement in place, then there can be a court action brought, or there can be mediation, or whatever the parties decide that they want to go through to try to claim that money. All right, and so then it defines that if 6E there, where if the escrow agent is an attorney, the money will be received, it will be deposited and released as required by law. If it's a brokerage, then a brokerage company has to follow the real estate commission's rules and regulations, and that's why a lot of companies have gone to having the earnest money, or the attorney hold the earnest money, because the attorney doesn't have to follow the real estate commission rules, they just have to follow state law, where we have a little bit more regulation and oversight with brokerages. So number 7, conveyance and date of closing and possession. So this is where you would write who is going to take ownership of the property via general warranty deed. So in some rare cases, you may have different names here than the names that are at the top of the contract. You may have, a parent that's signing a contract, and then down on the deed, it's actually going to be a parent and a child, or a parent and their spouse or something. But for whatever reason, only one of them wanted to obligate themselves via the contract. So that's rare, but it's possible. And then you define the closing date down here. Transaction will be closed on or before, and so that is an on or before date. That is not a this is absolutely when it's going to happen. It just says on or before. And so that's something that would also, the closing date must be agreed upon really by both parties, but it is on or before that certain date. 7A there talks about the seller being obligated to vacate and give possession at a certain time. So the vast majority of that time is going to be at closing. So the seller is going to, at closing, the seller is going to get their money and they're going to hand over their keys. Possession changes hands at that moment. It's also the obligation of the seller to give possession of the property free of debris and in a clean condition. So who knows what free of debris and in a clean condition is? What'd you say?
I said, oh boy.
Free of debris and in a clean condition.
Like any inspections or
If you know the definition of it, you are smarter than me. There's not really a very great definition of it. And so what I generally do, what I recommend to do with your clients is when you're showing a house to a buyer and you're going under contract, is say something to the effect of, hey, they knew you were coming, so this is probably as clean as their house is going to be.
Yeah.
So if this is not your version of free of debris and in a clean condition, then I would probably ask them to have a professional cleaning service clean the home before closing.
oh,
If it is, if you're okay with it like it is, then that's great. It's never gonna be better than this. It might be worse than this, but it's not gonna be better than this, because this is them trying to sell their house. Once it's under contract and they move the furniture and all the dogs' hairballs and everything else comes out, one person's version of free of debris and in a clean condition may not be what your version is. So if that's gonna cause you angst and you're not gonna plan on cleaning the house yourself before you move in, then I would say let's ask them to go ahead and have a professional cleaning service come in after they've moved out prior to closing.
I bought a house December, but then I came over to closing and they were still sitting in the living room.
Yeah.
On the couch.
I would say that is not free of debris and in a clean condition.
I opened the door like, what is that?
Yep. So at closing, as defined in paragraph 2C, so that's where it defines the closing, 24 hours after or 48 hours after or in accordance with attached agreement. As far as our office goes, the boxes you check are either the first one or the last one. There's not really such thing as 24 hours after or 48 hours after without having some sort of agreement in place that you have an attorney write up for you. Generally, the closing attorney can always write those agreements up, but we're just not going to check 24 hours or 48 hours and just not define how that's going to work. There's a lot of things that go into that. I would never recommend doing that unless it's the craziest of circumstances.
And talk to me first, please, so we can navigate that.
Yeah. Call your broker to talk about that, because that's a big liability. There's all kinds of insurance things and all kinds of other things that go along with holding possession after closing. There's a separate agreement that we have that's called seller occupancy after closing, and so there's an agreement that you can use to help you define that, but still talk to your broker so that that's such a rare situation. We want to make sure you're covered. All right. So then another important paragraph is 7B. So if the buyer has provided written loan commitment, everything's good, they're moving along, or if it's a cash transaction, they've met the terms and conditions, but it hasn't closed within the stipulated time limit, both parties agree to extend the contract for a period of not to exceed 5 business days from the contract closing date. So a lot of people in our market, you will hear a lot of people, and I will tell you, there are people who have been in the business for 3, 4, 5, 10 years that have probably never been to a contract class like this before. And so their interpretation is just their interpretation, and they think they may know what's best. And as new agents, you may go into it and somebody will say something and you may think like, oh gosh, maybe that is right. If you going through this contract class, you will know what's right. And so you'll hear people say all the time in our market that, oh, it's an automatic 5-day extension. Don't worry about it. We got 5 more days. It's not an automatic 5-day extension.
I hear that all the time.
People say it all the time.
Yeah.
But it's a 5-day extension that happens if they've met all the terms and conditions of everything else, and their loan is approved and they're good to go. The purpose of this paragraph is not to give people 5 more days to get their crap together. It's really, all my crap's together, but we just had a snowstorm that knocked power out of the city, or we just had a flood, or the attorney just had a baby and isn't going to be there tomorrow, or whatever it might be. That just gives you 5 days to kind of get that thing sorted out, even though you were ready. Both sides were ready, but for whatever reason we couldn't close. That's what that paragraph is designed for. Right, yep. That's what that's designed for. It's not designed for just willy-nilly like, I don't really want to close today, let's wait until, I don't want to close Friday, let's do it Monday. That's not what that's for. It's for if it can't close, then you have that paragraph to use as long as the loan commitment is there. All right, so fixtures and personal property. This is another important paragraph. This is a big change paragraph from the previous version of this contract. So paragraph 8, fixtures and personal property. This paragraph defines what a fixture is as part of the contract. And this paragraph is going to be different than the way fixtures were defined in real estate school. Because generally in real estate school, fixtures are defined as if you need to take a tool to get it apart or get it loose, it's a fixture. If you don't need a tool and it's just hanging there or whatever, it's not a fixture.
I have heard another saying, like if you were to flip a house over and then shake it, like whatever's attached to the house.
Yep, I mean that's probably a pretty good one too. So this paragraph defines some things further, because there's a lot of things that were confusing, especially technology things. As technology has advanced, there's things that have gotten confusing. TV wall mounts and brackets are a thing, where the TV technically they hang from the brackets usually, and so TVs are not fixtures, but the brackets that they hang from are fixtures because those are screwed into the wall. Yeah. And those wall mounts and the brackets that hang from them both need to be left. So you can't just take the TV off and take it with you, and then you get this useless wall mount with no brackets for the next TV that comes. So that's something this is a paragraph to really go through with your clients to make sure they know what is and what isn't attached, and what is and isn't supposed to go, both from the seller's perspective and the buyer's perspective. You'll see this as exterior video cameras, video doorbells. So if someone has a Ring doorbell and they're planning on taking it with them, you need to make sure the seller knows, like, hey, or you tell the seller, hey, that's included. So you can't take that with you. It ahead of time, before when you list a house, you need to have that conversation that, hey, if these things are important to you to take with you, we need to define that ahead of time, or we need to just take it down so somebody doesn't want it, or so it doesn't by default get included in the transaction.
So what about the pool box? That's in the bottom of the pool.
So if you read in here, see which line it is. It's in here. I just got to figure out. Yep, so it's the third line of paragraph 8. It says landscape lighting, lawn irrigation system, and all related equipment, pool and spa equipment, window and door screens, storm windows, etc. So pool and spa equipment, if that pool equipment was there, it's a part of the sale unless it's defined separately. Same thing, there's some mirrors where even if it's a hanging bathroom mirror, where, like for your example, if you flip the house upside down and shake it, that mirror is going to fall off. But it's defined as, if it's in a bathroom, it's a standard to have a mirror in a bathroom, and so that's just defined as a fixture during our sale. So if there's anything that a seller does not want to include, they would need to cross it out of this paragraph and have it initialed. If there's anything additional that a buyer wants to include, they would write that separately on a bill of sale. And then you initial the bottom of each page. All right, so paragraph 9 is the last paragraph of the kind of contract terms and definitions. And this is home warranty coverage. So for the last, I don't know, year, 18 months, whatever it was, we haven't really seen a whole lot of home warranties because the market has been so crazy that buyers weren't asking sellers to cover home warranties, and so this was not really a very big part of the contract. We're moving into a market where it's going to become a bigger part of the contract. So it is a thing where a lot of people want a home warranty along with the purchase of their house. The buyers have the option to buy that for themselves or to ask the seller to cover it for them. And this is the paragraph you would do that. You would check either will or will not be provided. And any of these paragraphs that you see that say will or will not, they must be checked. One or the other must be checked. It has to be defined whether it is or it is not. So if you just leave it blank, it's not defined. Somebody could go back after you and just check a box, and you would be kind of stuck with whatever they decided because you wouldn't know that box wasn't checked. So always check a yes, a will or will not, or a yes or no when you have the option to do that. And then you check whether the warranty premium will be paid for by the buyer or the seller. These are also a thing in this paragraph and in the rest of the contract where you want to know the answers to these questions. It's not something that you just write, yep, they're going to provide a warranty and the cost is TBA and the company is TBA and we'll figure it out later. That's not how you write a contract. So every warranty company has a option sheet, a cost sheet, where you can go through and figure out, and you present that to your client and say, hey, here's what the options are. Which of these would you like for the seller to provide for you if we're asking for that? And then you can take that amount, write it in there, and you write the company, and then it's clearly defined. In some cases, you may see that the seller already has one that they put on the home, and the buyer has the option of just accepting that one or asking them to do a different one if they want. But that's something to make sure you're looking for on the listing itself. If they say, yeah, home warranty is included, then they've already got one. You just ask which one it is and get the sheet to make sure you know what the costs are, know what it includes, and make sure that's okay with your client. And then the last of those checkboxes, it's going to say buyer's agent or seller's agent who's writing the warranty. Generally, that is, if it's already in place, then you check the seller's agent. If the buyer is asking for it to be done, then usually the buyer's agent is going to write it. And that's done. We can talk to one of our home warranty reps about how to do that. We have classes for that every so often. But most of the time, that's just something you go online and just put the address in, put the client's information in, and hit register, and it's all done. It's paid for usually at closing. All right, so that kind of completes that first paragraph there. I think we've been asking questions as we've gone along, but does anybody have any questions about that first kind of initial? That's one of the more important paragraphs. We spent a little bit of time talking about it. Questions at all? All right, so we'll move through to section number 2, which starts with paragraph 10. So transaction costs. This is where buyer's transaction costs are defined and seller's transaction costs are defined. So it defines what a buyer's transaction cost is and what a seller's transaction cost is. An important part of that paragraph is if you've agreed upon real estate brokerage fees, there's a buyer that is now a buyer's cost, transaction cost. So you can have that paid either by the buyer or the seller. That didn't used to be in the buyer's transaction cost, so it's hard to get a buyer to pay those transaction costs for you. But if you've agreed on a certain percentage of commission with your buyer, the seller is only offering another part of commission. So let's say you've agreed on 3% with your buyer, the seller's offering 2%. There could be a 1% gap that you're talking to your buyer about making up. What this paragraph allows for is it allows you to make up that 1% as part of their transaction costs. So when you come down to letter A and B as part of this paragraph, the buyer is going to ask either for them to provide their own closing costs. So we're all going to pay our own. So the buyer's going to pay buyers and the seller is going to pay the seller's costs. Or paragraph B, where the buyer is asking the seller, hey, I'd like you to provide X number of dollars in transaction costs as part of the transaction. And so that is a way that the buyer can use that 1% commission or whatever percentage it might be and include that in transaction costs that the seller winds up paying for them. So it's a way to kind of get the seller to pay that commission even though they hadn't said that they were going to. A big key with that paragraph is you must put a number in there. You can't just put all, because nobody knows what the transaction costs will be. And if the buyer says, hey, I'd like the seller to pay all my transaction costs, and the seller says, okay, sure, I'll pay all of them, then the buyer can just say, okay, I'm going to get a survey, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get that, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get that. They're paying all of them. I'm getting everything. I'm going to pay 5 discount points. I'm going to do all these things. So it needs to be a clearly defined number. As a buyer's agent, you usually get that number from the mortgage person. The mortgage person is going to give you a estimate of costs, and you get that estimate, and that should be a pretty accurate representation of what they expect. And so, they say it's going to be X number of dollars. Like, let's say you talk to the mortgage person, they say, hey, we're anticipating it being $5,000. So as you're working with your buyer, you just got to talk to them and say, hey, the lender's guessing $5,000. It could be a little bit less or a little bit more. And if you want to ask the seller to pay that $5,000, that's great. What that's going to mean is the seller's probably going to want more for their house because that $5,000 is going to come out of their pocket. And so what we want to make sure of is you don't want to just say, okay, lender says he thinks it's going to be 5. Let's just ask him for 10 to make sure we got it covered. Because as soon as you ask him for 10,000, that seller is also saying, okay, I was expecting to get 200, but they want me to spend $10,000 on closing costs, so I'm really going to need to get like 210 out of my house instead of 200. And so they're essentially in their mind in their negotiations raising the price that they're willing to accept for the house based on what you're asking them to cover. And so if it winds up only costing your buyer $5,000 and the seller allowed for $10,000, then the seller just got $5,000 more money than they were planning on getting, which also means your buyer could have got a $5,000 better deal on the house. Does that make sense? And so you want to make sure, I usually have a conversation with the buyer about, do you want to make sure no matter what, that your transaction costs are covered even at the risk of paying a little bit more for the house? Or do you want to make sure that you get what you can have covered, but you don't want to spend an extra $1 for the house and you're okay having to come out of pocket for a little bit more money in closing costs if that happens? And so I give them those options. And I say, okay, if you want to make sure that they're covered no matter what, maybe we ask for $5,500 if the estimate was $5,000 from the lender. Then we just make sure, hey, if he underestimated by a little bit, we got you covered. And if they say, nope, I want to make sure I'm not overpaying for the house at all, and if I got to come out of pocket for closing costs myself, then that's cool. Then I might say, all right, let's ask for $4,500 then. And then maybe that there's a few hundred, if he overshot his estimate a little bit, then maybe there's a few $100 there that you want to have him to bring more than you would have had. So, and obviously there's no obligation to ask the seller to cover closing costs. The buyer can just say, hey, I'm good, I'm going to cover all my own. Or they can cover $1,000 or $2,000, that's great, I'll cover the rest. It's all up to the buyer and how they want to handle that and proceed with that as part of their negotiation. All right, so adjustments, another important paragraph. So all prorations, taxes, anything else, everything is prorated to the date of closing. And that's based on the most recent bill, tax bill, and prorated on that basis. So what that means is that there are not estimates. This is an important paragraph because we need to make sure that we're protecting our clients. So if you in South Carolina, you've got different tax rates. So if a investor is selling a property to an owner occupant, the tax rate for investors is a lot higher, significantly higher than an owner occupant. And as soon as that owner occupant buys that house, they can go apply for their owner occupant exemption, which is going to drastically reduce those taxes for that year because they don't go back and prorate. It's immediately just change the status and the tax bill is going to be less for that year. So if, let's say, August, we're having a closing and it's investor seller selling to an owner occupant, and you go under contract in August, that tax bill might be, let's say, $10,000 for that year on that property as an investment property. Well, if we prorate it based on, or let's say $12,000 to make it easy, and we're closing at the end of August, so that's 8 months worth. So the seller would have had to give or allow for $8,000 at closing to cover the tax bill when the tax bill comes out at the end of the year. Because the buyer's buying the house in August, they're not responsible for taxes for the whole year because they haven't owned it for the whole year, right? So that seller is responsible for paying their portion of taxes. So they get $8,000 taken out of their proceeds at closing, and they'll have that when the $12,000 bill comes out at the end of the year. But after closing, they go down to the county and say, hey, I'm not an investor, I'm an owner-occupant, give me my owner-occupied rate. That tax bill drops to, let's say, $3,000 or something like that. It's a lot of times a third or a fourth of what the bill would be as an owner or as a investor. So they've had $8,000 paid to them for the proration, and their entire tax bill is only going to be $3,000. So they just got this extra windfall of a little bit more than $5,000 in their prorations. And so if you're working for that seller who's selling the investment property, that's a really important thing to note and to change this paragraph. To say, it's not going to be done based on the most recent tax bill. It's going to be done based on some other thing. And there's a lot of ways to do estimates. You can print out an estimate from the county website and say, hey, we're going to do it based on this estimate, and both parties agree, even though it's an estimate, we agree we're going to do it based on this instead of some other thing. So you can print out what the owner-occupied estimate is from any of the county websites. And in the same regard, if you're working for the buyer, you probably want to just say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to see if my buyer can get the extra little windfall there. So, but I also would make the buyer aware of it, that, hey, the seller might have this big problem at closing when they see that they're getting $8,000 taken out of them for taxes, and you're going to get it and get the tax bill reduced. So, it may come up later, but per the contract, they didn't catch it, and so we're moving forward, and you might get this big windfall later. So that's a big deal to make sure that you monitor that and talk to your clients about how that's going to work. And in the same breath, if you're working with a buyer, and a lot of times the assessments have not kept up with the values of the homes, and so if you're working with a buyer and let's say the assessment price of the house or assessed value of the house is, let's say, $150,000, and that people have lived there for 20 years and the assessment just hasn't kept up, and they're now buying that house for $300,000, you've got to know that the proration is going to be based on that 150, whatever the taxes were at that 150, because it's based on last year's tax bill. But as soon as they buy it, their assessment is going to go up to what they call the point of sale assessment, which generally is going to be the purchase price of the house. So the assessment will double when they buy it, which will then double their taxes. And so that's another thing that you want to ask for, that, hey, we're going to go based on this estimate of what the taxes will be at a $300,000 price when that bill comes out at the end of the year, rather than what it was last year, because it's not going to be at that assessment anymore this year. So those are things that come up and happen. That's where being an expert in our field saves money for our clients. Oh, let's see, I skipped up here. All right, so the financing paragraph. This is where you make it either contingent or not contingent on the buyer obtaining financing. And so anytime a buyer is obtaining financing, we really need to make it contingent on that financing. The only exception to that is if the buyer happens to have enough money to be able to buy the house with cash and decides, hey, I don't need to make it contingent on financing. I'm going to try to get financing, but if I can't, I'll just buy it with cash. That's really the only exception to that. Otherwise, if someone's buying a house with financing, getting a loan, it needs to be contingent on the buyer obtaining financing. And so all of these financing contingencies expire 5 business days prior to and not including the closing date that was set forth in paragraph 7. And so essentially that contract becomes non-contingent at that point. So we need to make sure all of our lenders, especially lenders who aren't local, most local lenders know that there's that 5-day thing. But if it's not a local lender, if it's a national lender, somebody who's out of town, we have to really let them know that, hey, you've got closing dates, the 31st of the month, but you really got until the 25th to let us know yes or no for sure we are good to go. Otherwise, if you get to the 27th and you say, oh, sorry about that, we can't close, you're really messing up the buyer, because they're going to lose their earnest money and they might get sued. So that 5-day window is a really important thing, that if you're coming up to that 5-day window as a buyer's agent, you got to make sure that you're on that lender. And if you don't have an answer on yes, we're 100%, we're good to go, we're clear to close, if you don't have that 5 days prior, then you need to ask for an extension of that financing contingency.
Can I say something?
Yep.
So when you ask for an extension, if they don't answer, you have to be strategic, because just because you ask for something doesn't mean that we got it. They have to answer by signing that addendum back to us. So sometimes the way I strategically navigate just what I do, of course, always talking to your clients is the most important because it's their decision. But when I'm getting close, and it's more so conditions for, and I don't know about you, but for me, it's more so for conditions that are still left for the buyer. If it's just like conditions of final appraisal or title or something like that, I might not get too crazy. But if we still have conditions that buyer hasn't met and they won't extend or they haven't responded, I will send a terminate. I'll send a release. I'll say, hey, we're coming up on this. Since I haven't heard back, I have no other choice but to release my buyer from this contract because we can't get to come to terms. You haven't responded. 9 out of 10 times they finally respond when they get the release. They're like, oh, okay, we're getting on it. But that's me protecting the buyer for not losing that earnest money and capturing that and pushing them into a corner. It's everything strategic.
Yeah. If you got until 7:59 a.m. on the day that you're going to be inside that 5-day window. So at 8 a.m. you're inside that 5-day window. Mm-hmm. If you send that extension over on, let's say, 2 p.m. the previous day, I would have that conversation with the buyer to say, hey, we've got to get this back signed before 7:59 tomorrow morning, and if we don't, I'm automatically triggering this terminate. We're going to go ahead and sign the termination, and we're going to send it to them at 7:58.
Yep.
Because if we don't, then you're inside your 5 days, and you can't do that anymore, and you're stuck.
We're done.
And you might lose your earnest money.
Right.
And so you kind of have both of them. You have the extension signed, and you have the release signed. You send the extension, and you hold the release, and just hopefully you get that back. If you get it back, you just kind of tear the release up. But if you don't get it back, then hey, here's the release. You got to get what protecting my client.
Right.
Yep.
And if they send back a signed extension, you can rescind the release.
Yep.
So you're okay with that.
Yeah, because you just go back to that one paragraph with the appliances. So now the washer, dryer, everything is there, stays? Does it show me? Like all appliances?
Say that again now.
So like all appliances stay, that's what I'm still thinking. Like
He's
the
going
washer,
back to
dryer.
the
If you go back to the fixture paragraph, it says appliances such as, or appliances including stoves, ovens, dishwashers, and any built-in appliances. Mm-hmm. So washers, dryers, refrigerators aren't built in.
So they take the fridge.
Right. They take the fridge, take the washer and dryer. Yep. Unless you ask for them separately on a bill of sale.
Right.
Now there are some fridges that are built in. I mean, there's some that are like literally built in and attached, and they have trim. Like you can't really tell. They have wood panel doors that look like the cabinets. Those are built in, so those would stay. Most commercial grade refrigerators are built in, so they would stay.
So when y'all get a new listing, you get a new listing and you start talking about those things, ask them, so are you planning on leaving the refrigerator and or the washer dryer? And then if they say, yeah, we don't want them, I always say, well, let's don't list them.
Yeah.
Let's still don't list them because we can use that as a negotiating card. Okay, we'll do that. We'll leave the fridge and washer dryer if y'all blah, blah, blah. So that's what I do, and I know a lot of agents do it. So it's something good to think about is, don't list them, then you can have them as a card to negotiate with them.
Buyers think they get a win, even though we're leaving them anyway.
Yep.
Yeah, you're gonna leave them anyway because we bought new ones.
There's two sides to that. I always give people the option. I'll say that, like, hey, we can, like, if you don't, I know you don't want to take them, but let's just leave them out because we can use that as a negotiation piece. But then the flip side of that is, or we could just say we're including the washer and dryer and the fridge. And there's some people who are looking for a house like that because they don't have any extra money. So like, hey, I have to find a house that includes everything because I don't have money to go buy this. I'm using all my money on my down payment. And so that's like an extra enticing marketing piece that like, hey, come buy this house, move right in, all your stuff's already there. And so like, which one of those do you want to do? Do you want to do it that way or do you want to do it that way? And sometimes I've had people say, yeah, that sounds good. Let's use that to our advantage to start with because I don't want to leave them anyway. I don't want to take them with me anyway. Let's just use it as a marketing piece and go with that. So depends on price range a lot too. Like if I'm listing a $150,000 house, I'm probably saying they're included. I'm going to recommend that they say that they're included.
Yeah,
because
I can't think of it, but I know it's a contract that's basically like that. That if you want, you can if you go into a lender and you was like, I want a property, and it has all the appliances and furniture. Isn't that a contract like that? And they would just basically give you like more money to cover that purchase.
No, not really.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
No cost or value.
But that's like if I'm listing a lower priced house, there's usually more value in those appliances. So a lot of times I'm going to recommend like, hey, if it's a $400,000 house, let's just use it as a negotiating piece. Somebody who's buying a $400,000 house can probably also buy a refrigerator and a washer and dryer. If it's a $175,000 house, I'm probably saying, hey, let's include that because that's in this price range. That's an enticing thing. Not all houses are including in that, and that's something that's going through somebody's mind. They might not say it. Like, oh, all these houses we're looking at don't have a fridge and a washer and dryer. How am I going to wash my clothes? And
That's such a good point.
where when it actually, and they may choose the one that has them without really saying it because they might not want to talk about like I'm worried about not being able to buy my appliances.
Lori said we can even put it in the public remarks
Right.
so that if they are too embarrassed to talk about it, they can see it.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Like you use it as a marketing
good.
piece. Like, hey, this house comes with everything. It's
It
all
has everything. You're ready to you can eat that night and then watch
Yep.
it.
So, all right. So then you go down and they initial that they read that paragraph. That if the buyer fails to close after that 5-day window, then they could be in default of the contract. Earnest money will be released to seller, and they could, as part of that paragraph 6D, they could be sued if they decided to. So then you check what type of financing. So this is where it's very important to talk to the lender, right? Talk to the lender, make sure you know what kind of financing is happening. Not just because you're nosy, but because you need to know that because it's part of the contract, and you want to structure the contract in a way that's going to be beneficial based on the financing type that you're using. So, I don't know who that is.
Okay.
So conventional, FHA, VA, USDA, housing, conventional, all the different things. There's lots of different types of financing that you can use. If for some reason your financing type changes based on whatever it is, if you start with a lender and they say, hey, we're going to do conventional, and it turns out, hey, conventional is not the best path for you, let's go FHA instead, you've got to let the other side know, and the other side may decide they're not okay with that because they've agreed to a conventional deal. If you can't go conventional anymore and you have to go to FHA or USDA or something else, they could decide, yeah, we're not going to be cool with that, we're going to void the contract. The only time they can't void the contract is if it doesn't impact, like if you went from conventional to cash, then cash is better than conventional. They wouldn't really have the option of voiding it. It's just if it changes the contract, or if it changes the fundamental terms of the contract, then they could void the contract.
And there are times where you can be having someone that is weighing both conventional or FHA, and you can actually check both and put "or" in there and do capital and underline it, but make sure all parties, all of them, everybody initial and date, and that will be acceptable, so you don't have to renegotiate.
Yep.
Initial take that actual little war,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. There's a FHA or VA addendum that has to be accompanied with either of those types of loans, and so this is just all parties agreeing that they're going to agree to sign that addendum. So it's a good idea to just have a copy of what one of those looks like, because some people may ask that question, like, well, I'm not going to agree to sign something I've never seen. Okay, well, cool, here it is. Like, this is what it's going to look like. It just has to come from the lender, and it's going to be fine. Application for financing. If lender financing is being used, buyer has 5 business days from the date of contract acceptance to apply for financing. And so again, that's something that we need to be mindful of as both a buyer's agent and a seller's agent. We need to be on the lenders to say, hey, tomorrow's the deadline. Has my guy gotten you everything he needs to get you, and has he paid for everything, and have they, done everything that's required in this paragraph? Because it says application will include advancement of any funds required by lender and providing lender's identity to the seller. So that application for financing part, sometimes people have to pay for an appraisal up front, and if they haven't paid for that appraisal, they haven't technically applied for financing. And again, the seller calls that lender and says, hey, have they completed all these things? And that lender says no, the seller can immediately just say, okay, they're done. I got this better offer. I've been waiting to try to avoid this contract somehow, so I'm out. So you got to make sure as a buyer's agent that your deadlines are met.
Yeah, it's better for the if I'm a buyer's agent, I would want my buyer to make sure that he has financing already, or if he
Right. Yeah, it's usually going to be something. Most of the time, if I'm writing a contract with somebody, they've already done these things.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a formality. Like, hey, application for financing. Yeah, 5 days to apply. You've already done all this stuff, so you've already applied. We're not worried about it. They've already told them they're using, Mortgage Network or Guild or whatever mortgage company they're using. So you're good. But you just want to make sure that that is the case for sure, that they have done those things.
Yeah, well, my buyers, when they come to me, I want to make sure that they already, talk to a lender or
Yep.
someone.
Yeah, you don't. Most people don't put a buyer in the car unless they've already pre-approved. Yep.
Yeah.
So, should the buyer fail to apply for that loan, they would be in default within that first 5 days. And so, the seller has the option of avoiding the contract, with the earnest money being released to the seller. If the loan is denied while subject to a financing contingency, it could be voided and earnest money would be released to the buyer. Anytime a loan is rejected by the lender, so hey, we've made our application within that 5 days, and then however many days later, the lender comes back and says, hey, it looked like from pre-approval you were going to be able to get this loan, but because of X, Y, and Z, you can't. We have to deny the loan. You've got to immediately let the other party know that that's happened. So if it's been rejected, you must give written notice of each occurrence of that happening to the seller or the seller's agent immediately, and then they have the option of either saying, hey, no problem, like, hey, this lender rejected it, I've already talked to this, or I've sent it to this lender, I'm pretty sure they're gonna be able to do it. If you just give us another day, the seller has the option to either say, yeah, take your time and get something else, or no, you were denied, I'm putting it back in the market. We're voiding the contract and we're done. So that's just up to the seller, but you have no choice. If it's denied by the lender, you have to let them know. You can't just say, oh, it's denied, let's see if we can go find something else, and then we'll tell the seller. It's not allowed.
Like if they tell you like on day 2 of those 5 days, then you still have to, does that cut off the other 3 days? You know what I'm asking?
Nope. It says, if the loan is rejected by initial lender or subsequent lenders, buyer or buyer's agent must give written notice of each occurrence to the seller or seller's agent immediately. So you got to give immediate notice.
No, so I got that, but I mean, does that still, can they say, well, we still have 3 days and I can get another approval in 3 days?
No, because it's already been denied by the initial lender.
Okay.
Like if it's
Even
rejected
though you
by
have
the
5
initial
days
lender.
to shop lenders.
Well, you've got 5 days to apply for the loan.
Yeah.
So you've applied for the loan and they rejected you.
Yeah.
So you took 2 days to apply instead of taking 5, but you applied for it and they've already rejected you.
And you only get 1 shot, so you can't say, hey, but we know this guy will.
You can, but it's a seller's option to say, yeah, we're going to give you that time right
Okay.
now. Yep. Yeah, because it says the seller has the option of continuing with or avoiding the contract. So they can continue with or avoid the contract. So if they decide, yeah, that's fine, we'll continue it. If you want to take 2 more days to go talk to this other lender, you're still within your 5 days, cool, go do it.
Okay.
But they could also say, no, you were denied already, and that's freaking me out. We're putting it back in the market. If you want to go talk to another, like when it happens to something like that with me, with a seller, sometimes I'll say, you know what, we're going to put it back on the market, but if you can go talk to another lender and get something and send us a new offer, and we'll
Come back
we'll
with
consider
the
it. Yep.
So, and
You
obviously,
don't pay more this time.
But that also, I mean, that also is a risk you run because they might find a better house within that same time too. So, you gotta explain the risks. So if the buyer elects to make any material change to their financial condition after contract acceptance that negatively affects the ability to close the transaction, the buyer will be in default and earnest money will be released to seller. That's a big one. And financial condition is a broad term. So, if they go buy a new car, I've had all of these happen where they go buy a new car a couple days before closing, that's going to change their financial condition. The lender checks their financial condition a day or 2 before closing, sometimes a day of closing. So if they pull a new credit and there's a new auto loan on there, they're probably getting denied. I've had people go run up credit card bills because they're buying furniture and they're buying other things to put in their brand new house, and that causes their loan to be denied. I've had somebody get a new job. He quit his old job, got a new job. The new job paid him double what he was making before, and his loan was still denied because it was in a totally different field than what he had been working in for 20 years.
I just got a call yesterday where we had one of our agents deal with this where the buyer, we represent the seller, but the buyer went out day before closing, pulled up a line of credit, opened up a credit card, and it blew their debt income out and it dropped their points, and now they're going to need to pay back whatever they pulled out. And it's like a 68% chance that they'll get approved in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm
So
like, you're breach.
that's the thing when you're working with a buyer. My conversation is everything from this point forward. You sign a contract. Everything from this point forward needs to be as vanilla gets. Don't deposit $10 in cash in your bank account. Everything that you deposit has to be tracked. If you got $10 in cash, you make a Super Bowl bet with your buddy for $50 and you win, put it on your mattress. Don't put it in your bank account. If you don't get a new job, don't quit your job. Just tough it out for the next 30 days if you have to. Don't go buy a new car. Don't go start buying stuff for your new house yet. You got to own the house first. And if you go start buying stuff for your new house, you're going to be stuck with a bunch of new stuff and not going to have anywhere to put it.
Yep. And
So-
don't close any credit cards.
Yep. Just don't change your
Don't
change your
anything
financial
without
condition.
pocketing something.
The lender has taken a snapshot and they say you're good to go like you are, so don't change what you are. And that includes something you think would be better. That's the guy that got the job that's paying him twice as much. He was a like a security guard and became a postman or something. And he was like, man, I'm making more money. What the heck? And they're like, okay, but you have a criminal justice degree. You've been a security guard for 15 years, and now all of a sudden you're a postman. The lender sees that as risky. Like, what happens if you go out there and start walking neighborhoods delivering mail and decide, forget this, I'm going to do something different. And you go back to doing something different that pays you less because you're not going to make as much if you go back to the security company that you're working at for 15 years. So that they view that as risk, even though it's more money. So what may make sense in the buyer's head may not actually be correct. And so I actually have that conversation. Like, well, you may think you're doing yourself a favor, and you're not. Just don't change anything. Wait to change anything until after closing.
But you're not.
Stop thinking. Stop
Just
thinking.
don't think. He said, don't breathe, don't think. Just
So-
it does what it's told.
Seller financing. In the case of seller financing, this paragraph here says terms can be noted in paragraph 22 of the contract. That's not okay. At Keller Williams Palmetto, if there's going to be seller financing involved in a deal, talk to your broker and have a separate agreement written up. Any closing attorney has agreements like that are written up for seller financing. It's very rare that that's in play on a transaction, but if it ever is, just know that's not something you should do without consulting professionals.
Yeah.
Cash transaction, within 5 days of the contract, since there isn't a loan involved with a cash transaction, you've got to verify those funds within 5 days. So partial availability of the funds, if they're being sourced from the sale of a property. So if it's, hey, I'm selling this property and I'm getting the money from that property, then you still need to verify that, yes, this is what I'm selling it for, this is what I owe, and so here's where the money is going to come from. So that's something, again, as a seller's agent, you need to be on that to verify it, because you don't want to just take, oh yeah, they're buying it with cash, but turns out they don't actually have any money to buy it with cash. That's a terrible conversation to have with a seller after they've been waiting on a closing, and then you find out that there's no money. Appraisal value contingency. And so the contract is contingent on the property appraising, and that is, it either is or is not. You can check is or is not, but again, you must check one or the other. You can't just leave them blank. You have to check either is or is not, contingent on the appraising. And that is really all it is appraising according to lender's appraisal for finance transactions or buyer's appraisal if there's a non-lender finance transaction for the purchase price or more. It doesn't say anything else about any other appraisal conditions. It only talks about price. And so that's where it says appraisal value contingency. It's just talking about the purchase price. So if it doesn't appraise for enough money, then and it's contingent on the contract, then there can be a renegotiation. So it says later on in that paragraph, the buyer will have 3 business days after notification of the results of the appraisal to either proceed without regard to the appraised value or attempt to renegotiate. So essentially, the buyer can say, hey, it didn't appraise for enough, I'll just make up the difference with my own money. Or, hey, it didn't appraise for enough, I'm just walking away. Or it didn't appraise for enough and I want to renegotiate, let's come to a meeting of the minds somewhere in the middle. But if that hasn't happened in those 3 days, then either party can terminate the agreement. So if it's gone 3 days and they can't come to an agreement on who's going to do what, then either party can just say, okay, we're walking away. What that doesn't say is if it appraises and it was represented that the house was 3,000 square feet and it turns out it's only 2,500 square feet, if it still appraises for enough, that's not a contingency of the appraisal that you could walk away from. Now, you could potentially sue the seller for misrepresenting, but that's not something that you can use within the appraisal value contingency. So if there's something on the appraisal that the buyer just doesn't like and it doesn't involve the purchase price, they're on their own. They could try to sue you for misrepresentation or something like that, but as far as this paragraph goes, they can't just say, hey, it turns out that X, Y, and Z happened on the appraisal and I'm not going to buy it. Well, if it appraised for enough money, you don't have that option. You got to buy it. All right, and then seller gives permission to closing attorney to obtain seller's mortgage payoff information. That's just the seller saying, hey, you can pay off my loan as part of closing. There is one important paragraph that I forgot to go through here. So paragraph 4 up here, as part of B, It says buyer gives permission to lender to disclose any allowable pertinent information concerning buyer's loan to attorney and the buyer, representing the buyer, seller, and the buyer and seller's brokers. So buyer and seller brokers were defined earlier as the agents working on the transaction. And so if you are a buyer's agent and you call the lender and the lender says, oh, I don't have permission to talk to you about that, you can always reference back to that paragraph and say, this is the contract, this is where the seller gives you permission to talk to me about this. I need to know this information because it's pertinent to the contract. I need to know if they completed their application or not, and you need to tell me because they've given you permission to tell me. All right, so now we move into number 3, Roman numeral number 3, so paragraph 4 of the contract. And I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit here because we're coming up on time before too long. So due diligence, inspections, and repairs. This is a very large part of the contract. So the buyer has the right to have the property inspected, or at least examine the property or test the property in any way, shape, or form that they want to, as long as the inspections are not destructive. So they can't go kick holes in the wall and make sure that there's not rats in the wall. But they can do pretty much anything else as long as it isn't destructive at all. And there are a few different options on what they can do during that due diligence or right to inspect period. Now, this is maybe the most important sentence in the entire contract right here at the top of this page, and that is select only one of the following options. If no option is selected, the contract will default to option C. And so option C, as you'll see, is the worst of the options, and that is the property is being sold as is without a right to terminate. So if you do not check one of these and initial it, your buyer is stuck buying the property without any option to terminate because of due diligence. All right? So the 3 options are property sold subject to due diligence period. That is the most common option. It's going to be subject to due diligence period. Or you can check that it is sold as is with a right to terminate, or it's going to be sold as is without right to terminate. All right, so you got 3 options there when it comes to due diligence. The most common of those is that sold subject to a due diligence period. All right, and so during that due diligence period, the buyer is going to have 10 business days. Again, business days are 24-hour period from 8 a.m. to 8 a.m., beginning at the time of final contract, at the buyer's sole expense, to conduct whatever non-destructive inspections and examinations that they want to do. So they can do whatever they want to inspect, heating and air, termite, lead-based paint, radon, whatever they want to do, mold, mildew, whatever, and they can do that. There is a way to ask for an extension, which again, you got to ask for that extension and make sure that you have it agreed upon before you can just assume that you've gotten an extension. But if for some reason there are certain times in the summertime, certain times of the market where when you call an inspector and ask them to inspect, they're booked for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And so in that case, you got to know that that's the case, and then know that you're asking for an extension as part of the contract, or immediately after you go under contract, you got to get that extension, or you got to call a different inspector and try to scramble to get somebody in there. Because the good inspectors, they only do a couple of inspections a day a lot of times, and that doesn't take very long to get them booked up for a while when there's a lot of contracts going back and forth. So if you have to ask for an extension, that paragraph there defines how you do that. And then the due diligence procedure. So the way that I like to explain it is there's 3 options. So you do all your inspections, you've got 3 options once that happens. As a buyer, they can either accept it and just say, okay, cool, I've got my inspections, I'm not scared of anything, I'm gonna move forward. They can say, holy cow, this is a disaster, I'm out, I'm done, I'm not doing anything, I'm gonna terminate. It's rare that either of those happens. It's almost always the third thing. And that is where, okay, I've done my inspections, that's great. And some things I don't really care about, but some things are a big deal, and I'd like to ask the seller to remedy these or fix these. Or I'd like to ask for a reduction in price or a credit or whatever. And so if they're just going to accept it, they just let them know, hey, I'm accepting it, we're moving forward. If they're going to terminate, you put a termination together and send it over to the other side. You've got to do whichever of these things have to happen within that 10 business days. So inside that 10 business days, you've got to either accept, terminate, or request a remedy. All right, and requesting remedy, in order to do that, you're going to put together a repair addendum. We're going to talk a lot more about repair addendums. Lori's got a class Friday.
Friday.
So in 2 days, on Friday, Lori has a class about her repair addendums and how you go through that procedure and how you ask for them and how you protect your buyer and how you respond to them as a seller and all those good things. So you can request remedy, and again, that can be either asking them to repair things with a licensed contractor, or it can be, hey, we just want a $10,000 deduction in price. It can be any of those things. But you've got 10 days to ask for them, and then you can see here there's a time frame for negotiation, and that's 5 days. So the key here is that you've got 10 days no matter what. So during that 10 days, you can send over a repair addendum. If you wanted to send another one, you could. There doesn't have to be one. Most of the time it is just one, but just know as a seller that don't agree to one and think you're done, and then they send another one. Make sure that if you agree to one, you say this concludes the due diligence period. But they've got 10 days to send that over, and then from the end of the 10-day due diligence period, you've got a 5 business day negotiation period. So even if the repair addendum is sent over 3 days into the 10-day due diligence, that doesn't stop the due diligence and then trigger the 5-day negotiation. You've still got your whole 10 days of due diligence and your whole 5 business days of negotiation.
So what happens?
Unless that's agreed upon separately, you
can't get the inspection until day 7. You have a 10-day due diligence. Day 7, day 8, we decide we want all this fixed. Due diligence is done at day 10. We have 5 days after that.
Yep.
Okay, but can we still get our money back in that 5 days?
Yep.
So it's actually a 15-day due diligence.
Well, it's a 10-day. That's it. That's exactly it. It's a 10-day due diligence, and then there's a 5-day negotiation.
Okay. Yeah.
So you have to get whatever the request is going to be to them within that 10 days, and then you've got 5 days after that 10 days to negotiate out what's going to happen as a result of that request.
Good question, because I've had new agents ask me before. Well, so does that mean they can send in the repair addendum on day 13? And I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Extend it in by 10 days. So yeah, you have 15 days, but don't think about it like that. Think about it. You have 10 and 5.
Yep.
As long as it's in by 10, then you have 5 extensions.
Yeah, exactly. So you have, like, to use your example, you have your inspections on day 7, you decide what you want on day 8 and send it over, and then really you've got 2 more days of your due diligence. So really you have a 7-day negotiation period at that point, because it doesn't start until the end of the 10 days.
I got a question.
Yep.
After the inspection period, and the inspector sends us a report and has a pricing, basically how much or the damage.
Nope. So the inspector is just going to send over a report. It's not going to have pricing.
Okay.
So that's part of what you do during that 10 days.
That's what we do.
You try to get the report in, hopefully in like 5 days, 6 days, 7 days. And then a lot of times you're going to have to, as a result of that report, you're going to have to call contractors for your buyer and say, hey, we need to know how much this, and this are going to cost. And sometimes if you can't get a number on those beforehand, you just ask the seller to take care of them. And then the seller's got to go back and figure out, okay, they're asking us for a new roof, what's that going to cost? But there's different strategies. We talk about that more. Lori will talk about that a lot more in the due diligence class, because there's different strategies there. Sometimes it's better to get the estimate and send it over, and sometimes it's better to just ask them to fix it.
Yeah.
It just depends on who you're dealing with and the situation, the timing of it all, and everything else.
The loan that the buyer has.
So after that 5 business day, if for some reason you haven't reached an agreement on the addendum by the end of that 5 days, then buyer and seller can mutually agree to extend the negotiating period, or you can agree that the buyer. So if you don't agree, once that 5 days expires and there's not an agreement to extend, then the buyer has 2 business days after the end of that negotiation period to decide whether they're going to just accept it as is with no repairs or replacements, or they can decide to terminate. So hey, we didn't come to an agreement, so I'm just taking it like it is, or we didn't come to an agreement, so I'm walking away. Now the other thing to note is in the case of FHA and VA appraisals, this is on the top of the next page, that appraisal can call for other things. So then that's okay. It doesn't say that any and all things that have to be done during the due diligence period. If the appraiser identifies repairs to be made as a condition of loan approval, and seller elects to not make them, because the seller can elect to not make them because it's outside the due diligence period, the buyer has the option of what they're going to do as long as the seller is agreeable to that. So the buyer could say, hey, I know these have to be done in order for me to get my loan, I'm just going to pay for them. And if the seller's okay with that, then that's okay. Now the second option is sold as is with right to terminate. And so if you look at these 3 options we had earlier, it was either take it, leave it, or ask them to fix something. So what happens in this option B here is you lose that third option. It's either take it or it's leave it. You either take it or you walk away. And all else pretty much stays the same. So if you're, sorry, get my water here. So if you're, you do your 10-day due diligence, you do all the stuff, everything comes back the same way, but rather than saying, okay, we're sending over a repair addendum, your only option is either to say, hey, we're walking away, or we're going to proceed forward. Letter C is sold as is without right to terminate. So all that means is that, hey, we're buying it as is, like it's standing there right now. So we don't really have a due diligence period at all, we're buying it. If a seller wants to check that box, if a buyer wants to check that box, that's something that agents need to come talk to the broker about, because that's a very significant liability on you and the office if they go through that process. We need to make sure that they are very aware of what's going to happen in that situation, that they have no rights and they're locked into a contract at that point. All right, so condition of property, number 14 there, right before the next section. Unless otherwise agreed to, once inspections have been made, things have been done, the seller agrees to maintain the property in the condition that it was in as of the day of contract. So you can't just say, okay, I'm under contract, I'm not mowing the lawn anymore, I'm not trimming the trees, I'm not trimming the bushes, rocks get thrown through our windows, I'm not fixing it. That you can't do that as a seller. The buyer is buying the property like it is when they went under contract, and you've got to maintain it in that condition. And then also, again, in the same paragraph says that the seller agrees upon providing possession of the property to buyer, the property will be free of debris and in clean condition. So again, whatever that means to whoever it means, you got to have that conversation with your people. All right, so disclosures. This is Roman numeral 4. So property condition disclosure statement, by law, that has to be filled out as part of a transaction unless there's exemptions or unless both parties agree not to. And so this is where they would agree not to or agree that it has to be filled out. So letter A is where both parties would initial to say, hey, there is a property disclosure that's part of this transaction. Letter B is where they would say, hey, both parties are agreeing that property condition disclosure is not being provided, and the buyers are okay with that happening. Again, if that is the case for one of your buyers, it's a good idea to chat with your broker to have a conversation about that, because that creates some liability if you're just going to agree to take it without them telling you anything about it. If it doesn't meet one of those exemptions and somebody's not willing to provide a disclosure, that's cause for concern, because why would they not be willing to disclose issues that they know of? Because the property disclosure only asks, do you know of any following issues, yes or no? Do you know of them or do you not know of them? It doesn't say, I'm guaranteeing there's no issues. It just says, what do you know about the property? So if somebody's not willing to tell you what they know about a property, I might think twice about buying it.
Unless it's not the actual, if it's like an LLC or something.
You'll see a lot of investors.
Yeah, there's investors that try to do that, but the exemptions are like new construction, or if it's an estate or foreclosure or things like that, then they're exempt. But anything that's not one of those exemptions, they should know about the property.
Yeah.
All right, so lead-based paint, number 16. So again, anything, hopefully you all know this already, but this is very important, that a lead-based paint disclosure must be done at the time of contract. It really should be filled out prior to contract by the sellers and then signed as part of the contract by buyers. If the property was built before 1978. If there's questions about that and you don't know if there's not a date on the tax records of when the house was built, just do it anyway. It's not a big deal. But that's a federal document that comes with huge fines if you don't do it, or you're missing initials or missing anything that's part of that document. So we highly recommend making that document happen.
If you have a problem getting it, please call me. I will be more than happy to call someone's broker with that one.
All right, so property documentation. So paragraph 17, and you'll see right next to where it says property documentation, buyer to complete information in paragraph 17, 18, and 19, and seller to confirm. So like we talked about earlier, you want to make an offer as a buyer or working with a buyer that is clean and 100% filled out, so that other side is able to just sign it and you're under contract. If you send an offer that the other party can't just sign and go under contract, then you haven't sent a complete offer. And so part of that is filling these paragraphs out here. And a lot of times people will say, well, the buyer doesn't know what this is. The seller has to fill that out. The seller is the one that knows about the property. Well, that's correct, But if you don't know something as a buyer, you should be asking that before you make the offer. And when you're making the offer, you're essentially saying, hey, these are the assumptions I'm making as I'm making this offer. This is what I'm assuming about the property. And so if this is not correct, Mr. Seller, then you need to change these assumptions. So I'm assuming that it isn't subject to a third-party approval. I'm assuming that it's on public water and public sewer. It's not in a flood zone. It has association fees of $300 a month because that's what the listing says. And it, is not subject to a special assessment or anything like that. And so then we check all those and we send it over the offer. And if they're like, whoa, no, it's actually on septic and well, then they have to cross through that and come back and write septic and well. The flip side of that is if you don't fill this out for your buyer and you just have your buyer go through an initial blank contract, essentially, the seller fills out what the actual things are, and you're under contract because they filled it out. Everything's already been signed initial. It's going to be tough to prove that you didn't agree on those because you've already initialed and signed everything. So that's why the buyer fills that out first based on what their facts are that they know, and if there's a change, the seller has to initial it and change it, and that way it's very clear what happened and what was agreed upon. All right, and so flood zone, those are things that you can look up. You can ask the seller to provide information about that. If it defines what happens if they say it wasn't in a flood zone and it actually is, then how you can move forward or not move forward there. Association fees, special assessments, those are all things that should be defined on a property disclosure and in the MLS. So you should be able to gather that information from there. All right, and then additional contingencies, addenda, and other terms if applicable. So this is section 5. So there are documents there's 2 documents that are relatively common. That's called a sale and closing contingency addendum and a closing contingency addendum. So those are is or is nots on this contract. So again, you must check either is or is not, if it is or is not included. And so there's a couple things about these. Those are where if a person is listing their house and they're trying to sell it and they find a house that they want to buy, they can make an offer that's contingent on the sale and the closing of the house that they have listed. There's another situation where if they have a house that was for sale, they're already under contract on that house that they're selling, and they want to go buy this house, then that's contingent on just the closing. They've already sold, they've already gone under contract, all they're waiting on is the closing, and so they're making a closing contingency offer. So those are 2 different documents in a similar situation, just farther along in the progress, in the process of the sale. And then there's other contingencies. It's rare that other contingency is used. Just know that there's a difference between other contingencies and other terms. You'll see down here in paragraph 22, that's other terms. You don't need to call something a contingency if it's really just another term. So use paragraph 22 for the majority of your other terms. Other contingencies are certain things that the contract is dependent on, and if this or that doesn't happen or this or that falls through, then the contract falls through. Other terms are just additional items you want included to talk about in the sale. So if either of these sale and closing or closing contingencies are checked, yes, it's one or the other. There's never going to be both. It's either one or the other. But if those are checked, then obviously that addendum must be included with the contract and filled out and signed as well. We'll talk about those in a later class. But just know, after this additional contingency right here, the title, it says buyer's failure to disclose the existence of contingency A or B will constitute a default of this contract and earnest money will be released to the seller. So if they can't buy this house without selling this house and they don't say that it's contingent, and for some reason this house falls through and they're like, oh, sorry, my sale fell through, I can't buy. If they didn't fill these contingencies out, they're in default of the contract and they can lose their earnest money and be sued. So that was a big thing that was happening when the market was super hot. People were trying to just say, well, I just want to make an offer not contingent on selling my house. I don't want to tell them I have to sell my house because they're not going to take my offer. It's like, well, that's great, but you can't really do that because it is contingent. So you're basically lying in a contract, and that's not okay.
See, how come you guys don't do, like, it's weird, because where I come from, people do like lease backs all the time. You know, like, I'm going to give you 30 days to, get your stuff out, sign a thing, take $10,000 from the closing costs, put it in escrow. And if they damage the house, the $10,000 is forfeited immediately.
Yeah, it's not very common here. Part of it is because we are, I forget what it's called, but closing happens immediately at closing, where in a lot of other areas in other states, there's a delay, like it doesn't happen until recording and notification or something like that. and so it's like a delayed closing. And so in the states,
Take in title state or something.
there's a specific word for it, but I can't remember. But it's like in New York, for example, or Virginia. I know like around the DC areas like that, where you sell your house and you go to closing, but you don't actually get your money for another like 10 or 12 days. And so there's kind of this weird limbo or purgatory there where people are like, I don't really own the house yet, but you already sold it, so you can kind of live there. So there has to be some kind of agreement on how that works, because I've already given you my money, but you haven't gotten your money yet because the deed hasn't been recorded yet. And so like you just keep living there for a little bit, and then we'll figure it all out.
Well, that's weird because the market was so hot where I came from. People were doing anything they can to get the house. So they're like, yeah, I'll get it. I'll let you live there for 60 days, no rent, you know?
Yep.
And the people are just lucky to get a house.
Yeah. Different markets are different. It's just never been a thing here. But there's just a ton of liability that comes with that. And in higher price range places also, a lot of times there's more ability to do something like that, where I'll put up 10 grand, and if something messes up, I lose it. In Columbia, there's not very many people willing to put up 10 grand and then possibly lose it.
Who gets to live there, the buyer or the seller?
It's depending on what the agreement is.
The seller.
Yeah, sometimes it's hey, I'm gonna buy your house and you live there for 60 days until you find the house you want to go buy. Like, you need to have this closing and get your money before you go buy another house. Cool, go ahead and get it and just live there. I'll move in whenever you find your house that you want to buy.
When I sold my house in my ranch in Colorado, I said, I think you need 60 days. I said, I'm not closing on this until I have money in my, I'm not going to move all my stuff out and sell all my equipment until I get it.
Yep. It is difficult for sure, and that's why there's that 5 days, and that's why there's some of the things in our contract that prevent some of that stuff from happening. Where hey, if you're inside that 5 days, the seller's already got his moving truck loaded and stuff, because he's got to be out at closing. So if you've made them load your moving truck and they've already moved all their crap out, and all of a sudden you can't get your financing, like, you should have known that before a couple days before closing. So it's similar to what you're saying. It's just we do it ahead of time instead of afterwards. So like, you're locked in at that point, and your earnest money goes hard, and so that is kind of like we were talking about, that we'll put up $10,000. That's what the earnest money is for in that situation, where it's like, hey, if you're inside that 5 days and you tell me 2 days before closing you can't close, and I've already moved all my junk and got my moving truck loaded and all that stuff's already there, like, you're losing your earnest money, and I'm keeping that to pay me back for my moving truck I just paid for. So. All right, and then additional addenda. There are some additional addenda. There's like a lender selection addenda. There's other different kinds of addenda that you can make a part of this contract. You would just list the form number here, or the title of the form, and check that they are. But again, it's got to be they are or are not attached. You've got to check one or the other. So don't let those checkboxes go unnoticed. All the forms have a form number down here in the bottom left. So our contract is CCRA-01. Addenda they start with they're in the 10s, so like 11, 12, 13. So you can just call them by the form number, you can call them by the title. And then other terms are right here, so if there's some other term that you want to have included in the contract, you can put it in here. If it's more than like a sentence, you probably need to talk to an attorney and have them help you compose that. It's not something you want to get super complex, writing flowery, fancy agreements in this other terms paragraph. This is really just for very simple things. You're supposed to use a bill of sale if you want a refrigerator to be included or a washer and dryer to be included. Some people use this paragraph. It's not really the right way to do it, but it is very common that people do it that way. They just say, refrigerator to be included at no additional cost to the buyer and having no value in the transaction, in working condition, model number this, that, whatever. Some people will do that in that section, and it's pretty acceptable across our industry. All right, so other legal terms, paragraph 6. We saved this to the end because this is mostly the legal mumbo jumbo. Fire or casualty. If something happens with the house where it burns down or a tree falls on it, or heaven forbid anything else happens, the seller has to notify the buyer right away, and then there's a 10-day period where the buyer can decide what they're going to do. So they may say, hey, a tree fell and damaged the roof, no problem, just fix it and I'll keep moving forward. Hey, somebody threw a rock through the window, that's cool, just fix it and we'll move forward. Or you might say, man, there's people throwing rocks through windows out here, I don't really want to move forward. So, or a tree fell on it, like I'm worried about structural damage, so I'm out. Default, this is what happens when there's a default. So it talks about seeking remedy, et cetera, et cetera. If a court action is brought, the last sentence there is if a court action is brought by escrow agent or party to the contract, the non-prevailing party will be responsible for the prevailing party and escrow agent's attorney's fees and court costs. That's a big deal. Mediation. So everybody agrees that we will go to mediation prior to going to court as part of the contract. This is the entire binding agreement. There is no outside verbal agreements or anything like that. 27, non-resident tax. So if the seller is selling and moving out of state and doesn't meet any of the exemptions, then they would be subject to withholding tax. That's another huge conversation to have with the seller. If they're moving out of state or they're already a resident of a different state and selling, South Carolina withholds a 7% withholding tax from their proceeds. Time is of the essence, so this just means we can't drag our feet on purpose. We got to move forward diligently. We got to, work to complete the contract together with the other party. We can't just drag our feet on purpose and try to drag it out just for the heck of it. Survival, generally everything terminates at closing unless it's something that's meant to survive the contract. If there's some sort of an agreement where, a seller agrees that, hey, we're going to sell you this house, we're going to cover your HOA fees for you for the first year, or the first 3 years or whatever, then that would obviously survive the contract because that's something that is being agreed to happen after a contract. Settlement statement release, this just authorizes the closing attorney to furnish the agents with a copy of the settlement statement. So if that's ever an issue where an attorney is not giving you copies of something, you can go back and show them that the parties have agreed for you to have it. Sex offender and criminal information. So this is a big one. This is something that we essentially tell our buyers that we are not really allowed to check the sex offender or criminal databases for you because we can't say that we rely on that. It's not 100% accurate information all the time. There's no way for us to know that. So we don't want to tell somebody, hey, this house is for sale, but there's a sex offender that lives next door, so you might want to think about that. Because what if that information is out of date and that person doesn't live there anymore, and we just caused damage to these people because we told them inaccurate information? So we just tell them, hey, here's where you can go to check anything. You can go to the county website and look at crime stats. You can go to familywatchdog.us and check sex offender registry, but that's kind of on you, and you figure out whether you are okay with that or not.
You tell them to do that, and then they go to select.
Yep.
Select that right there on the website.
Yeah, I tell them to do that. Yep. Like if it's, I usually say, like, here's the thing, I can't check any of this stuff for you. If it's important to you, then I'd recommend you check it, because the last thing you want to do is buy a house and then check it and realize, oh gosh, I moved in next to somebody I don't want to live next to. But I can't check it for you and say, hey, don't move next to that person, because can be discrimination. I'd have to be 100% confident in my answer, and I don't know that person, so I don't know if they're the right person on the list or if the person moved and didn't update or whatever. All right, and then these last two paragraphs are the kind of CYA paragraphs for the agents. So non-reliance clause, this just essentially says, the way I explain this to clients is that, hey, I'm not twisting your arm behind your back, making you do anything. You're making your own decisions. I'm just giving you advice along the way. If you want to talk to any professional that is not a real estate agent, if you want to talk to an attorney, a tax advisor, lender, appraiser, surveyor, structural engineer, any of those people, talk to them, because I am not them. I'm just a real estate agent. And so if you want to talk to any of those people through the process, please do so. Please have a home inspector, all of those things, because that's important. And to go along with that, we as the agents in the property don't make any warranties about the property. It could fall over tomorrow for all we know. It seems pretty good to me, but we don't know how I haven't inspected the plumbing. I don't know how the air conditioning works. I don't know anything about the property. So all I'm doing is giving you advice along the way, and you need to talk to the correct professionals about all that when that time comes. So that's how those last two paragraphs go. And then you've got the information down here. All right, and so you've got buyer's signature, buyer's printed name. That LS stands for legal signature. So buyer's signature, their printed name and the date. Seller signature, printed name and the date. You do need to verify that the signatures are the same people that are on the contract. If there's two people as a buyer or two people as a seller, but only one signature, that's a problem. If there's one person as the buyer and there's two signatures, that's a problem. Make sure that the people signing the contract match up with the people who are on the contract as the parties.
You look on the deed, on their deed for sellers, right?
On the tax records, yep. And again, like we said at the beginning, you verify that with MLS and the tax records to make sure that they jive. And if they don't, then I'm calling the seller's agent and asking why.
Just have that come up too.
And then the bottom here where it says buyer's agent, company, license number, LLR office code, email address, phone number, those are also very important. They're part of the contract. So We don't want to leave things blank on the contract. You can look up when you're a buyer's agent. Don't just leave those blank. Just look up the seller's name. You can go on to LLR licensee lookup and look up their agent number and their office code,
That's crazy when they.
their email address and their phone number. Just put it all on there, and then that contract is complete, and we're all on the same page.
Or seller back up at the very
Because-
top, they won't put anything there. Well, it wasn't in there.
Yep. Because the other thing is, if you don't fill out that seller's agent's name and their contact information, and especially if it's, a property that isn't listed on our MLS or something else like that. And we actually just had this happen recently, unfortunately, in one of our offices where we had an agent who was seriously injured and went to the hospital, and he had deals going on and his contracts weren't filled out very well. And so we had to kind of figure out who in the world, like, hey, we're under contract. We don't even know who to call about these things that are happening and these deadlines that are coming up because the seller's agent information wasn't here. So we had to go do a bunch of research to figure out, like, where is this property? What was it? So just, protect yourself and protect your sellers and allow us to help you in case something like that happens.
And protect your broker in charge.
Yep. All right, so this last paragraph, we talked about this early on today. This is the section that is filled out upon contract acceptance, right? So this section is not to be completed until the conditions of paragraph 2B are fulfilled. So don't complete it until you have the contract back with all the parties agreed upon, the last initial with no more changes is when that part is completed. Like, hey, we've agreed on everything, we've signed everything, there's no more changes, here you go. Then the person who sends it to you, here you go, the other agent is the one who received it, and they're the ones that are gonna fill this out. So you don't say, hey, my buyer just put all the initials on here, we agree on everything, I'm about to send it back to you, I'm gonna fill out the bottom and send it back to you. That's not how it works. You send it back to them, let them look at it and say, yep, looks like everything's good, we're all good, we're under contract, there's no missed initials or anything. I'm signing it to verify that yes, I've received it and we're under contract, here you go. So failure to complete that section doesn't change the validity of the contract, again, because the contract is between two parties. So when the seller has agreed or the buyer has agreed, the last party's agreed, and the contract has been given back to the other party, you're under contract. So it doesn't change the validity of the contract. If this isn't filled out, this just really clearly defines the agreed upon time frame of all the inspections and all the time frames that happen in the contract. All right, and so then obviously at the bottom, once the above contract acceptance date and time are filled in, a copy of this contract in its entirety should be promptly forwarded to the other party. So obviously you fill that out, you don't just hold it, you gotta get back to them right away so that they know, yep, we're good, we're on the clock, we're rolling. And that is the contract in a nutshell.
Wow. You did it before today.
So we saved enough time for some questions. I know we asked questions as we were going through, but what other questions are there? Anything else?
I wonder if I could have owned that family.
What's that?
I wonder if I could have owned the family that was in there. It's actually, like, for closing on the house, if they're still in there when you come back. You own all their stuff, can I own their TV? I mean, was that mine after closing, if they still had all their stuff in there?
Technically, yes. You probably would have had a hard time proving it.
But what would a remedy be in the state of South Carolina? Say you come in there, there's no contract, the family refuses to leave. I mean, at that point, can you contact the sheriff? Because it's not
So no contract,
Yeah, you've essentially got to do like a writ of assistance. It depends on where you are in the process, but they had a contract they didn't fulfill, so there's probably some squatters' rights there. South Carolina's a squatters' rights state, so you probably have to evict them.
So after closing, they would be able to be squatters, even if there was no rental contract or anything?
Anybody can be a squatter. You could walk into a vacant house right now and just start sitting there, and they'd have to evict you out of it.
So I'd have to go through court, I couldn't just shut down?
Yep.
Really?
Everything landlord tenant act says, no matter what, you can't personally
Yep.
move somebody out of the property. You have to go through court and let the court tell
Yep.
the sheriff's office
There's
to do
a-
it. You have to be hands off.
Yeah, one of my mentors had a rental property that he had people that he checked on it. They hadn't paid in 5 or 6 months. All of their power was off and had been off for months. They were clearly not there anymore, but they still had stuff inside. And so he didn't go through an eviction because he couldn't serve the people because they just weren't there anymore. And so he was like, I'm just going to take all the stuff out of their house and put it in storage for a little while, and I'm going to go ahead and rent the house because it's just sitting here vacant. I'm not getting any rent. So he went through and did that, and went ahead and rented the house again. Well, the people came back to town from their 8-month worldwide tour, and we're like, what the heck are these people in my house for? Where's my stuff? What's going on? And and the guy that I'm telling you about had kept their stuff in storage for like 3 months or 6 months or whatever it was, and he had just thrown it all away. And so they came back and sued him and won. Like, in landslide.
But I guess I'm getting
There's something in Landlord Tenant Act that falls under abandonment, and there's very specific rules that you have to go through, and that's also legal in nature, so you have to go through
exactly
a
right. Like, you have to,
but this wasn't a tenant deal, this was a buyer seller deal.
Right.
Like you're, okay.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm coming to buy your house, Matt. You say, hey, Jeff, I'm gonna be out of here at closing time. I come back and we're sitting in the living room.
You don't close.
And we're what?
You don't close on the house though.
Yeah. So there's so
no, but I
usually
close and I come back.
But usually
why are you not doing a walkthrough right before going to close?
Well, because of the smoking deal.
Yeah,
then it's your fault for not doing the walkthrough before you close.
You know,
that's usually what it is. Is usually you go to the walkthrough first, and you don't close until you're done. And that's
if any of my agents don't do a walkthrough and end up closing in that situation, it's 100% that agent's fault.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
but those people have the legal right to stay there.
No, I mean, no, they don't have a legal right to stay there. But I think what would happen in that case is that you could, instead of having to go through eviction, you can go apply for what's called a writ of assistance, which is the same thing that happens if you foreclose on something and the people are still there. You don't have to actually evict them. You get a writ of assistance because they were already served through the foreclosure process, so they already should have known to not be there. And so it's like, hey, you were foreclosed on. You're not allowed to be here anymore. The writ of assistance is kind of like a short circuit eviction where the judge can just say, hey, you got 24 hours to get out.
Yeah.
And if you're not out, the sheriff can set you out. And so I'm pretty sure in that case it falls into that writ of assistance category where, like, hey, they were under contract, they knew they were supposed to be out, they're not out, like, you got to help me here. And the judge can just go force them to be out 24 hours, and if they're not, then the sheriff comes out, and the sheriff doesn't move their stuff out. You have to have somebody to move all their stuff out, but the sheriff has to be there while you move their stuff out. And then if there's damage on the walls and all that stuff, then that's like a civil matter where you have to sue them for what they did to the house while they were there.
Well, they end up being a really nice family. They understand the process.
Yeah, and that happens sometimes. Like, it's happened before where, you show up for the walkthrough the day of closing and people are still packing their bags and packing their stuff, and like, dude, it's 10 o'clock, we're supposed to close at noon, what are we doing? And they're like, oh, well, we thought we had all day to get out of here. Well, no, it's at closing means at closing. Like, we're closing at noon and you hand me the keys and I hand you your money. Like, so that's what it is. But that happens. That's why we go through this. That's why we talk about how we explain it to the clients so that stuff like that doesn't happen.
Can I go over the transaction cost on 10 again?
Sure.
Thank you. Great class.
Absolutely.
That was awesome. It was very informative. Thank you.
He's amazing.
The transaction costs?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
I appreciate it. Take care. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming.
You money for them to class.
Oh, wait, you just like go over anything?
Yep.
Like, yeah.
So buyer's transaction costs, so they're including but not limited to their closing costs, so anything associated with getting their mortgage, any prepaid items, which could be like home inspection or appraisal or whatever, insurance, so any kind of insurance that they're getting, any discount points they're paying to their lender, anything that's cost to obtain stuff from the homeowners association. So that's like sometimes you have to. It's like an estoppel fee that happens where you've got to get information from the homeowners association where they give you all of their reserves and all that stuff that the lender's going to want to know before they lend you on a condo. They want to make sure the homeowners association is stable, and so that's a buyer's cost to obtain those things. And so you can ask for that to be paid. Any interest, title fees, anything associated with the attorney at all for closing, any recording costs, and then like we said here, the brokerage fees, any inspector, surveyor, appraiser. So if you've agreed on brokerage fees and the seller's not paying any brokerage fees, then that can be a part of that. Then seller's transaction costs are generally anything associated with selling property. So like deed preparation is their cost. Any deed stamps, which is kind of like a tax on the sale, that's a seller's cost. Any cost necessary to deliver marketable title and payoffs. So sometimes something happens, we're on a title search, they agree on delivering marketable and insurable title, but sometimes a title search brings up an issue where there's something wrong with the title, and so if that seller has to pay to have that cleared up, then obviously that's the seller's cost because they're paying to have their title clean because they agreed to give a clean title as part of closing. And then any payoffs, anything associated with their mortgage to get their mortgage paid off, any taxes that hadn't been done or any prorations that hadn't been paid, anything like that. then all that falls on the seller's side. Holy cow! It just started pouring.
Yeah, I know. I heard that. I was like, wow.
So that's that.
Okay, and South Carolina is we're a tax deed state, right?
We're a deed.